people were seeing the Houthis as this low investment in terms of strategic importance for Iran. In fact, they've proven one of its most strategic cards.
What kind of concessions could the Houthis be seeking here?
Iran is only highly likely to double down on its support for its axis. So Saudi Arabia is keen on demonstrating that it could do much more than these strikes when it needs to. You can't have ambitious socioeconomic transformation plans and then live next to a ticking bomb.
The Houthis and Saudi Arabia are fighting again for the first time in 4 years. How did we get here? On July 13th, an Iranian aircraft carrying a Houthi delegation back from Tehran tried to land at the runway of Sana'a airport in the capital of Yemen. The country's internationally recognized government struck the runway to stop the plane from landing, saying that the flight violated restrictions on Iranian flights to Sana'a. The plane diverted and landed at Hodeidah instead, but the Houthis insisted that direct flights to and from Iran would continue and vowed retaliation, blaming Saudi Arabia, the backers of Yemen's internationally recognized government. The following week, the group announced a naval blockade against Saudi shipping in the Red Sea, conducting strikes against 2 tankers. From there, the conflict quickly escalated. The Houthis targeted Saudi Arabia's Abha airport and oil facilities in Yanbu and Jazan, while Saudi Arabia struck Houthi targets in Yemen. So, over 5 months into the Iran war, why have the Houthis escalated now? And could the war in Yemen be about to restart? I'm Tamara Hemani, and this is The Big Picture. Ibrahim Jalal, thank you so much for speaking with us today. It's a pleasure to have you on.
Pleasure to be speaking with you.
So we've seen now that the Houthis have announced this blockade. They have struck targets within Saudi Arabia. These kinds of actions have been threatened for several months now. Why now? Is this part of an Iranian strategy, or does it tell us more about the Houthis' own view of the conflict?
There are 2 sides of this story, or there are 2 angles. First, the timing and sequence of events suggest, of course, correlation with the US-Iran war, with the diminishing effect that the IRGC can exercise over Hormuz, and the increasing effect of the US blockade of the Iranian blockade. The Iranian seems very much interested, especially according to Reuters reporting on July 16 of their instructions for the Houthis to be in standby to activate a more significant Red Sea card. That activation compounds systemic pressure on global energy, but also the bypass of Hormuz, East-West pipeline, Red Sea ports. So it's a combination of maritime logistics, but also enabling infrastructure for processing, storage, and production of energy products that are necessary. And then on the other hand, a few hours after the Reuters report suggesting that correlation, Abdulmalik al-Houthi goes and delivers a speech of an eye for an eye approach, a measure for a measure, and within a few days announced the embargo. So the sequence of events here is pretty straightforward. It is self-explanatory. But to suggest that, because the Houthis have done it before many times, suggest that this is just about the US-Iran war would be dismissing the nature and the scope of the threat, not least for Yemen, Yemenis, for Saudi Arabia and the broader Gulf, and for, maritime security and the freedom of navigation transiting Bab el-Mandab Strait. The Houthis, of course, have a number of objectives. Chief among them are deflecting systemic mounting domestic pressures, including socioeconomic, tribal mobilization, lack of delivery of services, payment of salaries, or even granting the very basic foundations of political and civic rights. So the inside of the northwest of Yemen is boiling, and it's been boiling in ways unbelievably shocking for the past decade or so. Second is that they're trying also to seek and enforce their regional relevance, while they also try to manifest, in coordination with the Iraqi militant groups, but also the IRGC and Hezbollah, the unity of fronts at times when the axis in a state of decay. And that, them being the last resilient an intact axis player over the most geostrategic arena, that is over, with proximity to Bab el-Mandab Strait and Red Sea trade, and, on the southern tip of the Arabian Peninsula, them being able to disrupt not only energy flows, but also maritime shipping, which has never recovered actually from their 2023, 2020, 25 maritime sabotage and piracy, so to speak. And they also seek to extract economic and political concessions from Saudi Arabia. So combined, the external and internal drivers suggest that there are complementary motives for them to disrupt Saudi oil flows and energy flows more broadly, but also cause a little bit of panic. You cannot actually block Bab el-Mandeb Strait as opposed to Hormuz. All you need is to increase the level of uncertainty, pursue that pushes commercial restraint, and navigate that arena with military denial and economic compellence, so to speak.
So we'll touch on, as you mentioned, the rest of the axis later, but I want to dig more into the specific Yemeni context that you mentioned. So to pick up on a couple of points, as you've noted, acts of kind of regional resistance, as they're framed like this, serve to deflect socioeconomic discontent, as we saw with attacks in the Red Sea after the Gaza war. So there's that one argument that kind of rally around the flag effect. Another one that you mentioned is using this pressure to, as you said, not install kind of a permanent blockade, but to increase pressure on Riyadh, which obviously is a backer of the internationally recognized Yemeni government, the Presidential Leadership Council, or PLC, to offer some kinds of concessions to the Houthis, given that kind of any roadmap or framework for kind of peace negotiations was kind of dormant since 2022 for several years now. So I want to ask you, what kind of concessions could the Houthis be seeking here? And is this kind of calibrated escalation necessarily the most effective way to pursue them?
The Houthis thrive for war, on war. They have achieved all their political and economic objectives through war, or at times because of international pressure, through negotiations, even when they didn't have the upper hand militarily, as happened with the Stockholm Agreement. So for them, war is a doctrine, to get to their ends. Is it the most effective way? It has worked for them in the past. The whole policy of extortion in exchange or expectation of appeasement has worked. And therefore, they think they can keep this as an endless cycle. But the world changes. And with that, the security choices of regional states, right? And what the Houthis want is they want to expand territorially to rule all of Yemen, to be a recognized political authority. They want to have economic package that funds the future wars, and what they present also as quote-unquote reconstruction. And a bunch of other things. That means basically the full collapse of the Yemeni government. Just before this war, there were power sharing mechanisms. There were, even within Stockholm, revenue sharing mechanisms that were never implemented because they didn't want to. And we've been in a status of stalemate of no war, no peace now for a few years. And actually, although the roadmap was not implemented, they have received some forms of economic inducements under the table.
As you noted, a lot of the concessions they're seeking here are kind of about authority, territory, access to oil and gas reserves, officially being recognized as the authority in Yemen as opposed to the internationally recognized government backed by Riyadh. I wonder, though, part of this dispute was also about the ability for flights to transit between Tehran in Iran and Sana'a in Yemen, and having that corridor between Yemen and Iran. Is the Houthi calculation now that, in fact, coming out of this war, given Iran's strengthened position, this is the time to double down on ties and reinforce that linkage, given obviously the previous restrictions on air transit? And how does that impetus interact with trying to gain economic concessions from Riyadh, where the Saudis will surely say, well, if you're still going to just double down on your ties with Iran, of course, we're not going to put any money into, public sector salaries or some of the various arguments they've been having over economic inducements.
Yeah, the Houthis are, of course, doubling down on their relationship with Tehran and the attempt to establish an air bridge through Mahan flights. Mahan is, by the way, designated by the US Treasury. It's sanctioned. So any activities are always under suspicion. There's always the chances that you try to move IRGC advisors, arms, electronic equipment, surveillance, among others, which indeed has been the case for both flights, actually, July 3rd and July 13th. So these signals do not send any positive de-escalatory messaging. In fact, they show that the Iranians have gone by far in the most overt of ways to support the Houthis, challenging all the international consensus, because for over a decade, they've been denying all forms of support they've been giving the Houthis, right? And suddenly, you're willing to deepen this, to tell the world, I am deepening this two ways, and I'm willing to actually show that this is part of a preparation of an escalation that will be forthcoming in a week. And of course, for the Saudis and even the Emiratis and many actors in the region, they can't live with that for too long. You can't have ambitious socioeconomic transformation plans, development agendas. You host international events from Oxford into the World Cup in the next 8 years, and then live next to a ticking bomb. So at some point, you'll get down to deal with the hard choices. For how long can I sustain this?
Yeah, I want to ask you a bit about those hard choices and the possibilities for escalation. As we know, Saudi Arabia has been under significant pressure, facing strikes from both the Houthis from Yemen and the Popular Mobilization Forces, or PMF, a group of militias allied with Iran in Iraq. We saw recently that Saudi Arabia and the United States conducted joint strikes against those militias in Iraq. I'm presuming that's not only targeted against Iraq, but also a kind of signal to the Houthis. So could we see a round of airstrikes in Yemen? And more importantly, what effectiveness could that really have, given that obviously the Saudi-led coalition's airstrikes in Yemen didn't manage to accomplish anything, and nor did the US strikes against the Houthis in 2025, obviously degrading the group, but as we've seen, not eliminating it or changing its behavior, apparently.
The latest Saudi-US joint strikes on Iraqi militant positions in a number of Iraqi provinces is, of course, sending a message of deterrence, reshaping the rules of engagement, demonstrating that aggression against Saudi Arabia will not go unresponded to. And then this is a message not only for the Houthis, it's a message for a number of actors in the region, including the IRGC, because we've heard about a number of unannounced strikes. And this demonstration of resolve is also a sign that a number of other Gulf states could respond to these threats, perhaps in the future in a more coordinated manner. So Saudi Arabia is, the biggest player of the GCC and in the Arabian Peninsula, is also keen on demonstrating that it could do much more than these strikes when it needs to. And the other point, of course, I don't expect in any way, shape, or form US or any form of so-called Israeli strikes to do much territorial shakeout in Houthi positions. They could only destroy some support facilities, military assets, launch sites, target command and control locations. And this combined signal one thing, that for the past decade, the region had defined the Houthis as a threat. The international community only came to that conclusion when the Houthis started to threaten Red Sea shipping in 2020-23, thereby addressing it in their own way. Saudi Arabia and the Gulf had a moment of I told you so moment. So this is what I've been telling you. Now you're not hearing. You need to fully understand the depth and breadth of the threat. And it became multidimensional, especially with the IRGC's US-Iran war. This is also a threat to Saudi Arabia and energy supplies in the broader Gulf, but also a threat to about 12 to 15% of global energy flows, 20% of global container traffic in normal situations. Thereby, there is a potential to form a strategy to address the war on sea. You need to address the power imbalances over the ground. And that means that the Houthis are really pushing the limits in ways that make the potential of war within Yemen itself looming as the war to address all the wars within, that are spiraling or that are, spreading just because of this unresolved power imbalance in Yemen. And it's long overdue. And I believe that the Houthis will decide how far this calculus develops moving forward. If they really push hard, one cannot rule out the possibility of an internationally supported operation in Yemen.
I'm curious about the potential for conflict. Many do see this or have warned that it could develop into kind of a reopening of the conflict that has been frozen or stalemated for several years. But do you see now as a kind of, as you said, and I told you so moment, a wake up moment where they think, you know what, this is not just about another round of strikes or a maritime security conference. This is actually taking steps to confront this rather than treating it as another isolated incident that, will die down when this round of regional conflict is over until the next one?
Yes, the current latest Houthi escalation against Saudi Arabia and partly shipping in there at sea must not just only be seen through the prism of Iran. Yemen does not need more naval coalitions. It does not need more disintegrated international approaches to tackle the Yemeni problem that's spiraling. It needs a Yemeni regional, internationally backed strategy. And this strategy must center the restoration of state institutions, the strengthening of these, the support for the Yemeni armed forces and the Coast Guards, tightening on the illicit networks that continue to finance conflict, whether in terms of Captagon flows or arms or gold or other commodities that are really now deepening and facilitating cross-commodity exchanges between Yemen and the African Horn and beyond. And deciding that this is a moment to deal with this threat once and for all. And that means that if you empower Yemenis to pursue peace through strength, you're actually investing in decades of stability in the region and from the southern side, and also in global maritime shipping. But if people choose eventually, policymakers, to not walk the talk of understanding what we know today, assuming we didn't get the full picture a decade ago for whatever reason, I'm afraid there is also a risk of repeating the same old mistakes. The risk of the conflict expanding regionally and having interconnected pressures from the Iraqi, factions within the PMF, the IRGC, Al-Shabaab and the Islamic State, or even pirate networks across the other side of the Gulf of Aden.
Mammoth task, as you mentioned, even for an administration which, I hope you don't mind my saying, has perhaps slightly sharper focus and longer term thinking than the current American one. We know that President Trump is disappointed with the Houthis' conduct. He said until now they have behaved very professionally, and yet now they are making a mistake. Make of that what you will. But it is clear that they are seeing this as a time to crack down on all of these groups, and this is a real moment of contestation of authority between, Iran's allies in Iraq and Lebanon, for example, and the internationally recognized governments there, on whom the US is applying significant pressure to really crack down on these groups and to ensure they disarm with, fairly slow, if any, results thus far. In this case, Yemen seems like something of an aberration, or perhaps the strongest link in Iran's chain, in the sense that the government there seems the least empowered of all these countries and seems the furthest from the focus of the US administration. Do you think because of that, this political context is part of the reason why the Houthis seem to have emerged as perhaps the strongest member of the axis of resistance, given that the hits that Hezbollah in particular have taken and their distance from the Levant? And if so, do you think that's kind of spurring perhaps regional ambitions and making it hard to implement a kind of longer term political change in the country?
The Houthis, the perception of Houthi strength is only questioned by level of their popularity inside, and the popularity that's not built for people to rally squares. Ali Abdullah Saleh used to, fill the same squares, and eventually that square was filled by them when they decided to eliminate him in 2017. Um, Political change has been taking place since January in Yemen, and that has also been reflecting in the improving position of the Yemeni government, its military preparedness, its ability to improve a little bit its finances, and now that it wants to improve its oil exports again after years of Houthi economic warfare, is also a sign that it's getting its card gradually sorted in improving this international trust is a key cornerstone in any future process, be it peaceful or military. The US, of course, this administration has deprioritized the Yemen file much more than any other administration. However, the multi-strait crisis now from Hormuz to Bab el-Mandeb is getting Yemen back to the fore. I mean, the world cannot just pretend that they'll just strike a deal with the Houthis and think that the Houthis would be focused on their own issues. They can always surface back, just exactly as what happened from the US Houthi ceasefire in May last year, that Trump, thinking that was already dealt with, or that the Red Sea card was not activated in March during the 40-day war, because the strategic calculus is to keep it for a time when they need it most, is that this problem is going away. No, actually, if this administration, particularly the second Trump administration, needs to be remembered, it has a strategic opportunity now to continue on redefining the trajectory of the region by supporting a pro-statehood agenda, one that focuses on supporting the pillars of stability from within. You want to address counterterrorism? There are also economic logics to this. Who can tackle these economic logics? It's states, not militias. You have funds to support. You don't route it through hybrid states within states. You do it through, again, these states. So the whole approach has to differ. And the Yemen file is back slowly on the agenda now, because not Washington chose to do, but what the Houthis eventually chose. For how long this moment lasts is a question, because in just a few months ago, last year, when the naval coalitions and US strikes were launched, people were saying this is the last window. That window is now open again, and it might be open again months later.
I want to ask you on one more point about the Houthis' actions being so rapidly escalated in such a short window. Now, some of the analysis suggests that they fear they will be on the table, as it were, on the menu for any future US-Iran deal, and that they might be given up as, part of what Iran will offer the US, given it's, in their view, less likely to offer up its militias in Iraq and Lebanon, given their geographical proximity. And so their fear is that they would like to extract concessions or conclude a better deal with Saudi Arabia before Iran signs any deal with the US, so that it's negotiating from a position of strength and at the optimal time. Do you agree with that view, or is your view actually that emerging from this war, Iran will only double down on its support for such groups? It won't trade them as cards to be given because it sees their effectiveness as pressure tools. What trajectory do you think it will take in terms of its role in the Axis?
Drawing on precedent from the 12-day war and the 40-day war and the actions that the IRGC has taken, Iran is only highly likely or near certainly to double down on its support for its axis. In fact, it has been also seeking to reaffirm, if we look at the July 15 strike on Israel, for example, the joint attack, it was in doing its best to reaffirm the remaining coherence of the unity of arenas, that the Axis could still strike back, that it still also has the political and military will to challenge arms embargo on Yemen by transferring IRGC specialists on Mahan flights. This is not going away. It's part, in fact, much more than any time before of strategic doctrine. It will also double down on its relationships in the African Horn with state and non-state actors where possible. And it sees greater potential in the Houthis. People were seeing the Houthis as this low investment and low priority in terms of strategic importance for Iran. In fact, they have proven otherwise. They've proven one of its most strategic cards, that because of also geographical proximity, lack of strategic coherence on the US and its allies generally, that the Houthis have felt emboldened because of all those operations, and used these short-term limited military operations as, look, Israel couldn't defeat us. Look, the US couldn't defeat us. Look, Operation Guardian Prosperity couldn't. So who could? So they've used this rhetoric to also expand their mobilization. So the Houthis are set to continue escalation. It's very unlikely that Saudi Arabia will give them any form of concessions at the moment for strategic reasons, that they're seen from security angle as a long-term threat. And therefore, the Houthis think that this will get them anywhere at the moment. They're wrong. But if they think they can get themselves on the menu of the US-Iran war de-escalation map, which the Iranians have been trying to put some rhetoric into, there is a reasonable chance that this is also a secondary objective of the Houthi escalation, that if can get this directly with Saudi Arabia, they can try find it out through the regional de-escalation framework. And for the Iranians, they'd be trying to preserve the remaining coherence, sense of unity within the axis, and it serves also as a reassurance that no one will be abandoned.
Your view, I take it, is that Saudi Arabia will not offer the concessions the Houthis desire, and that this could escalate further between the two countries, as we've seen in Iraq recently.
Yes, and we've seen this very much clear through the Saudi actions, both its diplomatic statements, but also its military resolves across theaters, from Iraq to Yemen, and its unwavering support for its allies to counter that. So yeah.
Ibrahim Jalal, thank you so much for speaking to me today. It was a real pleasure to hear your analysis. I really appreciate it, and hopefully we'll be speaking again soon under better circumstances. Thank you.
Thank you very much.